He rode 200 miles with dust in his eyes and hope in his heart, only to find her laughing with another man. What began as a surprise turned into heartbreak. But heartbreak, out here, could be a beginning too. The town of Belridge didn't look like much, even in the morning light. A few storefronts leaning into the dust, a saloon with its signs swinging crooked on rusted hinges, and one livery stable where every saddle told story. Elijah Crane stepped off his horse with legs sore and stiff from 5 straight days in the saddle. His coat was caked with dust, his boots cracked from the sun, and every breath he took scraped his chest like sandpaper. But his eyes were alive. He hadn't shaved in 4 days, hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night, but none of that mattered. Not when he was this close to her. Her, Clara Weller. She was the only thing he'd thought about since leaving the ranch. The only reason he'd pushed through the blizzard on day 2, forded the swollen creek on day 4, and ignored the ache in his leg that had started somewhere near Carter Ridge and hadn't let up since. Clara had said yes to his proposal 6 months ago, back when the leaves were turning and Elijah had still believed the world might let him have something good without clawing away. He wanted to surprise her. That was all. The ring was still tucked in his pocket, worn smooth now from worry and the road. He'd had it made special, plain silver, but engraved inside with the only words that had ever come easy for him: "You're home." He made his way through town like a man in a dream, nodding to a shopkeep, tipping his hat to a child who stared wide-eyed at his battered saddle. Every face was unfamiliar. He'd never been to Belridge before, not proper. Just passed it once during cattle drive, and remembered Clara mentioning it was where her sister lived. She'd gone to stay there to help with the baby. He hadn't expected much. A small house, maybe a tired sister and a squealing infant. A warm hello, maybe a tear or two when she saw him. He didn't expect to see her sitting outside the cafe. Didn't expect her laugh to carry across the dusty street like it used to do on summer nights back on his porch. Didn't expect the man sitting across from her, leaning in just a little too close, his hand not on hers but near enough. Didn't expect Clara to be smiling the way she hadn't smiled in months. Elijah stopped walking. Just like that. Like a horse hit a wall of ice mid-gallop. He wasn't a man prone to delusions. He'd seen drought take down whole herds, seen a boy cry over his father's body in a mining collapse, seen love fade slow and quiet like fog off the canyon floor. But this he wasn't ready for. She hadn't seen him. She lifted a glass of water to her lips, the same lips that used to kiss his calloused hands without flinching. Her hair was pulled back in a way he didn't recognize. Her dress was new, soft blue with little white stitching at the collar. She looked lighter, somehow. She looked like she belonged to a life that didn't include him. The man said something, and Clara laughed again, brushing a curl from her cheek. Elijah turned. He walked back down the street the way he came. His boots thudded hard against the boards of the sidewalk. The weight in his chest settled like a rock at the bottom of a dry well. He passed the saloon and didn't stop. Passed the general store and didn't pause. The livery was where he ended up, not by plan, but by instinct. His horse, Jeb, looked at him with tired eyes. Elijah ran a hand down the gelding's neck, silent for a long time. 5 days, he muttered finally, voice flat. For what? The stable hand, a young girl barely old enough to reach the top of the stall gate, looked up. Something wrong, mister? Elijah didn't answer. He dug the ring out of his pocket, held it in his palm for a long minute, then closed his hand around it. He didn't throw it, didn't drop it either. He just stood there. Then a voice called out behind him. Elijah. It wasn't Clara. It was her sister, Maggie, the one with the baby. She stood near the stable's post, her hair wild from wind, cheeks red. Elijah, is that you? He didn't want to talk. Not now. Not to her. Not to anyone. But he turned anyway, slow and careful, like a man on thin ice. Maggie. She didn't know you were coming, she said quickly, eyes darting. If she'd known, she moved on. Elijah asked. Silence. Maggie looked down. I don't think she meant to. It just happened. Elijah nodded. That made sense. Things had a way of happening. Like rain after drought. Like winter after fire. He didn't say goodbye. He saddled Jeb, tightened the cinch, adjusted the reins. His hand moved without thinking. Elijah, where will you go? Maggie asked, stepping closer. You rode all this way. He looked up then, eyes steady but tired. I'll ride back. She blinked. Just like that. What else is there? There was no answer. Just wind stirring the dirt, kicking up the same dust he'd carried on his coat. By noon he was out of Belridge. By dusk he was back in a wild, the ridge behind him, the horizon burning red ahead. He made camp near a dry creek bed, too tired to care about the rocks digging into his spine. He didn't eat, didn't light a fire, just lay on his back, staring at the stars. Jeb snorted nearby, a soft, steady breath. Elijah let the ring rest beside him on the ground. He didn't cry, but something broke, quiet and final, like an old rope giving way under weight it should never have had to bear. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, and Elijah Crane, rancher, widower, fool in love, closed his eyes and waited for morning to hurt just a little less. Elijah didn't head straight home. He tried, rode a good 20 miles before the morning sun tipped over the high rock edge of Bitter Pass. But his hands didn't feel right on the reins anymore, and his legs, once strong as iron from years of fencing and hauling and riding long before daylight, trembled just enough to tell him he needed rest. His body was used to pain, sure, but this wasn't something he could muscle through with grit and saddle soap. He camped again the second night, just beneath a stand of cottonwoods, not far from where the cattle trail turned toward Winter Hollow. That night, he finally lit a fire, but only because the air was sharp and cutting and he didn't trust his own hands to stay warm. The ring, Clara's ring, he still carried, but not in his pocket anymore. It had moved to the small tin box he kept his tobacco in, though he hadn't smoked in years. He didn't think about her, not consciously anyhow. He thought instead about how quiet it had been since his wife died 5 winters ago, and how Clara's laugh had been the first thing to ever truly echo in the hollow space that was left. He thought that echo meant something. Now he saw it for what it was, just a memory bouncing back, not a voice answering him. The third day, Elijah came upon a man limping along the road with a broken wool tied awkwardly to his mule. The man looked up, sweat staining his shirt dark. You from Belridge? He asked. No, Elijah said. You look like a man who's seen something. Elijah didn't answer that, just handed over his only spare canteen and told him to turn back east. There was a watering hole about 2 hours behind him. On the 4th day, he reached Bramble Creek, a place he'd always avoided when herding. The land there was cursed, some said, not in any dramatic sense. No ghosts, no eerie lights, no tales of vanishing. Just land that broke things. Fences would rot faster there. Horses got spooked. Cows wandered too far from their calves. It was a lonely stretch, and the trees leaned in as though they knew secrets they'd never tell. But it was there, just past a dead juniper, that he saw the smoke. A thin line of it, rising straight into the sky, too thin for a chimney, too steady for a wildfire. Elijah slowed Jeb, listened. No vibración, no wind. But there, soft as breath, a cry. Not an animal. Human. Elijah dismounted before he even thought about it. Followed the sound on foot through brittle underbrush and low branches until he reached the clearing. He stopped cold. A wagon sat tilted at the edge of the brush. One wheel sunk into the mud, another cracked in half. Torn canvas, a few scattered belongings, blankets, a kettle, a worn Bible with the binding ripped. And near the base of a crooked tree, a woman lay slumped, one arm stretched over her stomach, the other curled protectively around a small bundle. She wasn't moving, but the baby was. Elijah dropped to one knee. He didn't shout, didn't call for help. Help wouldn't come out here anyway. He just moved, quiet and quick. The woman's dress was torn. Her face was swollen on one side. Her hair stuck to her cheek where blood had dried. She opened her eyes. Not wide, not panicked, just a flicker. And for a second, Elijah thought she smiled, but it might have been a grimace. Her lips were cracked. He reached out, hesitant. I'm not going to hurt you. Her fingers twitched. She whispered something. He leaned in, Water, she breathed. He unslung the canteen, tilted it to her lips. She drank only a little before coughing, and he pulled it back. The baby whimpered. Elijah saw now it was a boy. Couldn't have been more than 2 days old, still wrinkled and red and trembling. A second blanket lay nearby, lumpy. He reached toward it and paused. May I? She didn't speak, just gave a slight nod. Under the blanket, another boy, older, maybe 2. Beside him, curled into a tight knot, was another. Elijah counted 3. Then he saw the last one, barely a year old, his face buried in a too thin pillow. For boys, the woman was barely older than 30, if that. She had the thin look of someone who'd gone hungry too often, and the bruises up her neck told a story Elijah had heard before too many times. She spoke again. Ruth. Elijah, he said quietly. You safe now? She didn't answer. Just let her head drop against the tree, her eyelids slipping shut again. But her arms never moved from where they circled the children. Elijah stood slowly, taking stock. The wagon wasn't going anywhere. Too much damage. No horse in sight. From the looks of it, she'd been walking until her body gave out, likely carrying one child on her hip, another in her arms, dragging the rest behind her. And no sign of any man. He didn't ask. Instead, he got to work. It took him hours to rig a sled from the wagon's boards, using rope he always kept coiled in his saddlebag. The boys, dazed and skittish, didn't cry much. One clung to his leg. Another stared with eyes too old for a face that small. The baby whimpered off and on, and Elijah wrapped him in his coat. Ruth drifted in and out of consciousness. When she did speak, it was nonsense, half prayers, names he didn't recognize, fragments of memory spoken aloud in fevered murmurs. Once, just once, she reached out and grabbed Elijah's arm, her fingers strong despite her weakness. Don't let him find us, she said, eyes wide. I won't, Elijah promised. And he meant it. He brought them to his cabin by nightfall. The road was rough, and more than once he thought the sled would tip, but it held. The boys were too exhausted to protest. Ruth didn't stir again until he laid her gently on his own bed, the one he hadn't shared with anyone since his wife passed. He fed the boys oatmeal, mashed soft and laced with honey. Gave them water. Let them sleep on a pallet by the fire, wrapped in blankets he'd thought he'd never use again. And through it all, he didn't think about Clara. Not once. His hands were too full. His heart, too full of the small sounds of survival. The sigh of a baby fed, the creak of floorboards under a woman fighting to stay alive. It was well after midnight when Ruth stirred again. Her eyes found him in the dark. You live alone? She whispered. Elijah nodded. Edo. Why? My wife died. She closed her eyes. Then you know. He didn't ask what. He just sat with her as she drifted off again, his hand resting near hers, not touching. Just near enough to let her know she wasn't alone anymore. The fire cracked low. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, 5 strangers, 6, including him, breathed the same air. And something new began, not with a kiss, not with a promise, but with the simple, unspoken truth that sometimes broken things don't need fixing. They just need shelter, time, and a place to be held. Morning came pale and quiet, wrapped in the hush of snow that had fallen overnight. It wasn't deep, just a thin white skin over the hills, but enough to muffle the usual creaks and calls of the waking woods. Elijah stirred early, like always, but for the first time in a long while, he had reason to move slow. The house was full of small breaths, scattered blankets, and the soft thud of a toddler's foot kicking in sleep. He made coffee and stoked the fire, careful not to wake the boys. Then he stepped out to chop kindling. The air bit his lungs, but his arms moved steady, rhythmic. He wasn't a man who needed much. He'd learned that years ago, after burying his wife and child. But the sight of Ruth's boys huddled together on the floor had stirred something quiet in him, a sound he'd not heard in his soul for years. Not longing, not hope, just a reason to keep the fire going. When he returned inside, Ruth was awake, propped up on one elbow, her hair a tangle, her eyes sunken but alert. I didn't think we'd made it, she said. Her voice cracked. You did. Elijah handed her the mug. Drink slow. She took it with both hands, wincing as the heat touched her lips. "You brought us here?" He nodded. "I don't know how to repay you." He shook his head once. "Not asking you to." Her gaze flicked toward the children, still asleep. "They need food. A doctor." You need rest," he said gently. "We'll figure the rest out." Ruth's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She just nodded and drank the coffee in silence. The day unfolded in pieces. The boys woke hungry but unsure, too young to grasp where they were or why. Elijah kept things simple. Cooked cornmeal, added syrup, gave them spoons. They ate in silence, stealing glances at him. The oldest, he must have been 3 at most, finally spoke. "Mama." "She's here," Elijah said. "She's safe." The boy nodded slowly, as if testing the words. Later, Elijah hitched the mule and went to town. He hadn't been in over a month, not since the snow started. He bought medicine, dried fruit, rice, flour, asked after a woman doctor, and was told there wasn't one, not anymore. But old Mrs. Wickham, the midwife who'd birthed most of the valley, was still alive. He rode out of town with her bundled in blankets beside him, her cane wedged between sacks of oats. "Who's the mother?" she asked. "Name's Ruth. Found her near Bramble Creek." Wickham whistled low. "That cursed place. Thought folks avoided it. Seemed a right place for someone running." She didn't ask more, just nodded and stared ahead. "You trust her?" "I trust what I saw." Wickham smiled faintly. "You always were a quiet one, Elijah. That wife of yours, Miriam, she used to say you talked more with your hands and your mouth." He said nothing. Back at the cabin, Ruth's color had improved. The children were asleep again, and Ruth looked like she'd sat up only because she forced herself to. Wickham did her work briskly, without chatter. Checked the baby, checked Ruth's pulse, lifted her shirt to examine the bruises, and shook her head slowly. "She'll need weeks to heal," she said to Elijah later, when Ruth had dozed off. "Body's thin. She'll mend, but slowly. You got the room for all of them?" "I'll make it." Wickham studied him for a long moment. "I always figured you'd remarry. Didn't see the point. Do you now?" Elijah looked toward the closed door. "I see someone who needs help." Wickham snorted softly. "And help always leads to heart, doesn't it?" But she didn't press. Just gathered her things and left him with a jar of liniment, a bundle of herbs, and more silence than he knew what to do with. That night, Ruth asked him about the photos on the mantel. "You were married?" He nodded. "Long time ago. No children. One, a daughter. She lived 5 days." Ruth's hand trembled as she held the baby to nurse. "I'm sorry." Elijah only nodded. Days passed. The snow melted. Ruth regained strength in small pieces. Her voice firmer, her movements quicker. She began to cook again, simple meals at first. The boys grew bold. The oldest, whose name was Caleb, followed Elijah around the yard. Wanted to see the axe, to help carry wood, to pretend he was strong. "Where's their father?" Elijah asked one morning as they stood by the barn. Ruth stiffened. "Gone." "Will he come looking?" "He better not." Elijah didn't push, but he checked the locks twice that night. It was Ruth who finally spoke of it. One night, after the boys had fallen asleep, she sat across from him at the table, wrapping cloth around a jar of preserves. "I'm married, young," she said. "Thought I knew what love looked like. Thought it meant saying yes when you meant no, and staying silent when things hurt." Elijah watched her hands move. "He was sweet until I was pregnant. Then it changed. Got worse every year. I tried to leave once. He found me. Said if I ever tried again, he'd bury me in a place no one would find." And the boys, he didn't hit them. Not yet. But he yelled. Through things. Caleb flinched when doors slammed. That's when I knew. "How'd you get out?" She smiled faintly. "He went to town to drink. I waited until he was deep in the bottle. Took the boys. Stole a horse. Rode until I couldn't." Elijah didn't speak for a while. Then he said, "You did right. I left everything. You brought what mattered." Ruth's eyes glistened. "You don't know me, Elijah. I'm nothing special. Just a woman with too many scars and too little left." Elijah met her gaze. "I see someone who chose to live." That night, after the fire dimmed, Caleb climbed into Elijah's bed and whispered something in his sleep. Elijah couldn't make out the words. But the next morning, When the sun lit the frost outside and the air smelled like thawing earth, Caleb reached for Elijah's hand as they walked to the woodshed. "Papa," he said softly. Elijah froze. Caleb looked up, blinking. Elijah," he mumbled quickly. Elijah swallowed. "Papa es fine." The boy beamed. Inside, Ruth stood at the window. She'd seen it. Her hand pressed lightly to the glass, her mouth trembling. She didn't say a word. But later, when Elijah handed her a new shawl he'd bought in town, she took it without hesitation. Let her fingers brush as longer than they needed to. Held his gaze without flinching. Outside, the wind was gentle. Inside, something was starting to grow. Not quickly, not loudly, but steady, like roots in soil that had waited far too long for rain. It rained for 2 straight days, hard enough to turn the hillside into mud and wash the last of winter from the trees. The boys took to sitting by the window, counting drops, their noses smudging the glass, while Ruth tried to keep the damp out of their clothes. Elijah built fire after fire, dried socks and boots, and added another layer of straw under the bedding. He didn't complain. He never did. But Ruth could see it in the set of his shoulders. How hard he was working to make this house feel like home, for children that weren't his, and a woman still flinching in her sleep. On the 3rd day, the rain stopped. Mist hung low, but birds returned to the trees, and the creek behind the house rushed strong. Ruth stood in the doorway, her baby swaddled against her chest, watching the fog curl around the fence line. Elijah joined her quietly. "Storms passed." "Feels like it," she said. He didn't reply, just stared out into the thickening morning. "Elijah," she said after a moment, "why'd you really take us in?" His jaw worked for a second. Then he said, "Because I knew what it was like to be alone with nothing but the wind for company." She nodded slowly. "You don't ask for much. I learned not to expect much." The silence between them wasn't empty. It carried weight, like 2 rivers meeting. He glanced at the baby in her arms, the one who barely made a sound and rarely cried. "She got a name?" he asked. "Yo." Ruth smiled down. "For Josephine." But Caleb couldn't say it right. "So now she's just Joe." Elijah chuckled softly. "Yosu's here." That evening, Ruth found herself humming while stirring stew. The boys chased one another around the kitchen table, and Elijah was outside, chopping a stump near the shed. The rhythm of it all, the hum, the thud, the giggles, it filled the space in a way she hadn't realized was possible anymore. But just as peace had started to feel real, something broke it. It was near dusk when the knock came. Not on the front door, but the back, 2 sharp raps, then silence. Elijah had just come in, his axe leaning against the porch rail. He froze mid-step. Ruth's breath caught. He moved first, walking to the door with purpose, opening it swift and wide. No one stood there. Only a rock, placed neatly in the center of the threshold. A piece of twine wrapped around it, pinning a note. He bent, picked it up, read it, and didn't say a word. Just folded it, slipped it into his pocket, and turned back to Ruth. "What was it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing we can't handle." "Elijah," he met her gaze. "Someone's asking questions, but they haven't found us." "Not yet." Ruth's knees weakened, and she leaned against the table. "It's him, isn't it?" "I don't know," he said truthfully, "but I'll be ready if it is." That night, Elijah slept in the rocker by the fire, his rifle propped against the wall, his ears attuned to every creak. The boys knew something was different. Caleb refused to sleep alone, and the other 2 cried until Ruth sang the same lullaby she used when their father stumbled home drunk and angry. It didn't calm them, not fully, but it softened the fear around the edges. By morning, the note had burned to ash in the fireplace. Ruth never asked what it said. Days passed. No more knocks. No more rocks. But the air remained tense, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Elijah set new traps around the property. Not for game, but for footsteps. Strings that would snap, bells that would chime. He trained Caleb to whistle if he saw anything strange. Then one afternoon, while Elijah was out in the trees, Ruth found a mark carved into the fence. 3 lines, vertical, with a slash across them. A tally. She stared at it for a long time, heart pounding, before covering it with a handful of mud. When Elijah returned, she didn't mention it. Not yet. He looked too tired, too weighed down. And she needed to think. That night, she waited until the children were asleep, then stepped onto the porch, wrapped in a shawl. Elijah sat in his usual place, whittling a small block of wood into a toy horse. "I saw a mark on the fence," she said quietly. He stopped carving, looked up. "What kind?" She described it. His lips pressed into a line. "That's a hunter's mark. For tracking. For keeping count." "Of what?" "Of visits. Of sightings." He stood. "We're being watched." Ruth's hand gripped the railing. "What do we do?" He studied the dark trees for a long time. "We hold our ground. But what if he's really coming? What if he finds us?" Elijah's voice was steady. "Then he'll find out that you're not alone anymore." The days that followed were filled with quiet dread. Ruth felt it in every shadow. She flinched at bird calls, at creaking boards. She didn't want to live like this, didn't want her children growing up afraid. But there was nowhere else to go. Nowhere safer than this man who'd built a life with his hands and now used those same hands to protect hers. One morning, Caleb brought her a bundle of wildflowers. "Elijah said they keep the bad dreams away," he explained, eyes wide. She took them, blinking back tears. "He did he?" "He said Papa used to give them to Mama, too." Ruth's breath caught. "You called him Papa." Caleb shrugged. "He is, right?" She knelt down, held her son close. "He's the kind of man who could be." That evening, Ruth found Elijah mending the roof. "You don't have to fix everything," she said from the ladder. He glanced down. "Someone's got to. I'm not just talking about the house." He didn't answer, just tapped a nail into place. "Elijah," she said more gently, "what if we left?" His hammer stopped. "You want to?" "I don't want to run, but I want to live. You and me. We're carrying so much. Maybe it's time we set it down." He looked at her for a long time, then said, "I don't know if I can. I think you already are." That night, Ruth took his hand as they sat by the fire. The boys slept nearby, the baby in her arms. She didn't say anything grand, just leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. And for the first time, Elijah let himself rest. He didn't hold the rifle. He didn't stay awake all night. He let the warmth of her beside him ease the tight places in his chest. Outside, the bells on the perimeter remained quiet. But come morning, they wouldn't. Not when the past came riding down the hill. It wasn't a bell that sounded first, it was the horses. Two of them, kicking up dust as they cut through the edge of the trees, their riders hunched low against the morning chill. Ruth saw them before Elijah did. She had risen early, walked out to gather kindling while the dew still clung to her shawl, and heard the thud of hooves before she even turned. They weren't townsfolk. That much was obvious from the worn coats and way they scanned the landscape like wolves with unfinished business. One had a scar across his cheek that caught the rising sun just right. The other wore a hat pulled low, but Ruth saw the metal glint of something tucked into his belt, cold and deliberate. She backed into the house without a sound, barely nudging the door closed behind her. Elijah was already stepping down from the loft, shirt half-buttoned, eyes narrowed. Two men just rode past the tree line, she said before he could ask. They didn't stop, but they were looking. He didn't hesitate. Get the boys dressed. Quietly. Tell Caleb to take the others behind the barn. The root's cellar. Don't open it unless I knock 3 times. She nodded, swallowing the sudden dryness in her mouth. Ruth, Elijah said, pausing by the rifle as he slung it over his shoulder, they won't take you. Her voice trembled, not from doubt, but for what she already knew deep down. They're not after me. He didn't answer that. Just grabbed the axe on his way out. Ruth did as told. The boys sensed something different today, moved with less fuss than usual. Caleb, now wise in ways a 6-year-old shouldn't be, took his brother's hands and led them like a little general behind the barn, his own small fist shaking only once when Ruth kissed his forehead. Elijah didn't engage the riders at first. He simply stood at the edge of the porch, arms loose, eyes steady. When they circled back and trotted closer, he didn't wave or greet them. He waited. The scarred one spoke first. "Mornin'." Didn't mean to spook anyone. Just passing through. Elijah said nothing. "Looking for a woman and some kids," the other added, more direct. Running from a husband. He's paying real good. You see anyone like that? The scarred one pushed. Town folk say she might have headed north. Some said she was spotted near here. Elijah's eyes didn't move from theirs. You think I keep track of everyone who wanders these mountains? The scarred one smirked. Someone's got to. Otherwise, people go missing. Elijah took a step forward, just one. Enough that the creak of the porch made both riders shift in their saddles. This land's quiet for a reason, he said, and I am to keep it that way. The man with the low hat squinted. You got a family, mister? Elijah didn't blink. I had one. Lost Jing. He nodded once. So why risk yourself for someone else's? The man's voice had that slick cruelty behind it, the kind that dug under skin like burrs. You think they'd stay if it was you they had to run from? Elijah's jaw clenched. Some men are worth running from. Others are worth staying for. The silence hung heavy. Then the scarred one snorted, turning his horse. You're a fool. She ain't your kin. Not your woman. Just another straggler with mouths to feed. Elijah let them turn. Let them ride. Watched until the trees swallowed them again. He didn't relax. He didn't exhale. He went straight to the cellar, knocked 3 times. Ruth opened it slowly, clutching the baby close. They didn't find you, he said. They'll be back, she replied. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. Neither did Ruth. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. The boys huddled in their blankets, Caleb's arm wrapped tightly around Joe. Elijah, Ruth said softly, hours later, what would you have done if they tried to push in? He stared at the flames. I'd have made them regret it. You don't even know us, she whispered. Why do this? His voice was barely audible. Because I'm tired of graves. And you, your children, you're not supposed to be ghosts yet. The next morning, the traps had been tripped. 2 of them. 1 line snapped. 1 bell on the ground. No footprints. No clear sign of direction. Just a message. We're watching. They packed what they could. Ruth didn't ask where they'd go. Elijah didn't say. He loaded the boys into the wagon, tucked the baby close to her chest, and they left behind the cabin just as the sun rose behind it. They traveled west, following no road, just instinct. The forest grew denser, the air colder. Ruth kept her eyes ahead, but in her heart, she mourned. That cabin had been her first glimpse of peace, her first breath after so many suffocating years. That night, they camped near a river. Elijah built the fire low, showed Caleb how to layer stones around it. Ruth rocked Joe and whispered lullabies between her own teeth chattering. She expected him to keep moving in the morning. But Elijah stood over the fire, gaze cast far. I know a place, he said. Farther out. My uncle's old homestead. Empty for years. Needs work. But no one goes that deep anymore. Ruth looked up. Are you sure? It's harder to find. That's all that matters now. They reached it by the second night. The house was leaning but upright, the fence half-eaten by moss, but the bones of it were strong. The boys ran wild, chasing squirrels and pretending the shed was a castle. Ruth stared at the broken shutters and still felt hope. By the next morning, Elijah was sawing new beams. The next week, he'd patched the roof. Ruth found herself hanging clothes on a line again. The boys started learning animal tracks, how to fish. Caleb began calling Elijah Pa without prompting. And then, one morning, Ruth found something in the ashes. A coin, shiny, newer than anything they'd brought. She picked it up slowly. Someone had been here. Someone had left a sign. She didn't tell Elijah right away. But that night, as they stood watching the boys pile rocks near the creek, she finally turned. If we're going to be found, she said, then I want to stop running. He nodded. Then we fight. Not just for them, but for us. His hand closed around hers. The wind shifted, and in the distance, someone, was riding hard through the trees. The horse was lathered and bleeding from the bit, hooves raw, and the man atop, it looked like a ghost dressed in dust. Elijah saw him first, silhouetted between the trees, still as stone. The stranger didn't ride forward at once. He watched the homestead with a calm too deliberate to be friendly. Elijah didn't reach for his rifle. Not yet, but he didn't look away either. It had been nearly 4 days since the coin in the ashes. Ruth hadn't told the children. She smiled like she used to back when smiling didn't hurt. She hung linens, and her shoulders were lighter. But Elijah had noticed how she moved quicker between doors, how she double-latched windows. Now the man came forward, slow, careful steps, and raised one hand in mock peace. Elijah stepped off the porch, boots thudding against dry earth. "I'm not here to start anything," the man called. "Just got questions." "No one here's got answers for you," Elijah replied. "I'll be the judge of that." He looked rough but not wild. The kind of man who'd spent more time in saloons than saddle, yet still rode like he knew what this tasted like. Elijah stepped farther from the porch, putting distance between the man and the house behind him. Ruth was inside. So were the boys. "You're protecting someone," the man said with a smile that didn't match his eyes. "A woman and 4 boys." Elijah didn't speak. "Her husband wants her back. Says she ran off in the middle of the night with the baby and the rest. I imagine if she did, there was good reason. She's his wife," the man said sharply, tone tightening. "And those are his children." She stopped being his wife the moment he used his fists more than his voice. The man shifted in his saddle, reaching for the canteen on his side. Elijah's muscles tensed. "She yours now?" the man asked. "Is that how this ends? You marry a woman with another man's sons and call it justice?" "She doesn't need marrying to be protected," Elijah said. "And justice ain't in the ring on a finger. It's in keeping her safe." The man chuckled, but it was hollow. "He's paying. Real good. And others are still looking. Maybe not as polite as me. You want coin? There's none here. You want blood?" Elijah stepped forward. "You'll have to work for it." The man looked past him toward the window where Ruth stood, barely visible. "She don't look like much, but I guess every broken thing's worth fixing to someone." Elijah didn't move. The man took the hint. He turned his horse slowly. "This won't be the last visit," he said. "It better be." He rode off, slower than he arrived, making sure the message stayed behind like a bad smell. Elijah waited until the trees swallowed him, then went back inside. Ruth had the baby in her arms, her face unreadable. "Was it one of them?" she asked. Elijah nodded. "A scout." "More will come." She swallowed. "Do we run again?" He leaned his back against the door, exhaled through his nose. "Not this time." "What changed?" "I buried too many good things. I won't dig another grave because someone didn't like who you chose to be." That night they laid traps. Caleb helped drive stakes into the ground. Elijah spent hours stringing fishhooks through tin cans, his hands sure and methodical. Ruth didn't sleep. She sat beside the fire with the baby in her arms and the other boys curled around her. She thought about the woman she used to be, the woman who'd flinch at a raised voice, who once believed pain was a price for loyalty. But that woman was gone. At dawn, Elijah came in from a barn. "I saw tracks. 2 horses. They're closer now." She nodded. "We stay." He sat beside her, not touching, but near enough that his warmth reached her. "Whatever comes," she said, "we face it together." I wouldn't have it any other way. By midday, Caleb came running from the tree line. "Riders!" he shouted. Elijah stood, rifle in hand. Ruth gathered the boys in the back room, heart pounding. 2 men this time, different from before. These were hard-eyed and hungry, with rope coiled on their saddles and knives worn down from use. They didn't knock. They dismounted and started walking up like they owned the place. Elijah didn't wait. He stepped off the porch, rifle steady. "We're here for the woman," one of them said. "Then you'll leave empty. We've got orders. And I've got a grave out back that's just about your size." The taller of the 2 smirked. "You won't shoot." Elijah didn't blink. "Try me." The man reached for his hip. The rifle cracked once. The bullet didn't miss. The man fell, screaming, clutching his thigh. The other dove behind the water trough. "You can ride out of here," Elijah said calmly. "You'll even have your friend if you hurry." The second man rose, hands up. "I don't want trouble." "Then leave." He grabbed his partner, still cursing, and pulled him up onto his horse. They didn't speak again. Elijah watched them disappear into the woods before lowering his rifle. He didn't look back toward the house, but he knew Ruth was watching. That night, she said nothing. She just took his hand while the boys slept and didn't let go. The next day, something strange happened. A man came walking up the trail. Older, shoulders stooped, clothes simple and clean. He wasn't a bounty hunter or scout. He looked like someone's grandfather. Ruth watched him from the porch while Elijah came around from the shed, wariness in every step. "Can I help you?" Elijah asked. "I reckon not," the old man said. "Just passing through. Heard there was trouble. Thought maybe I'd check. We're fine. I see that." He looked past Elijah, directly at Ruth. "You're her, ain't you? The one that man used to call his wife." Ruth stood straighter. "I was his uncle," the man said. "Didn't approve of what he did. I tried to raise him better. I left," she said simply. "I took my boys. I chose life." "And you did right," the man replied. "He died. Couple days ago. Some fool tried to patch his leg. Got infected." Ruth's mouth parted, but no words came out. "He had no will. No kin left worth claiming. What little land he had, I signed away. Nothing for you to worry about anymore." Elijah stepped forward. "Why tell us?" The man shrugged. "Seemed right that you know." Then he tipped his hat, turned, and walked off the way he came. That night, Ruth wept. Not for him, but for the weight lifted. For the fear finally put to rest. For the future that now stretched out like an open field instead of a forest filled with threats. Elijah built a bigger table the next day. Ruth started a garden. Caleb carved a small wooden plaque with the word home and nailed it to the door. And when the baby took his first steps, it was into Elijah's arms. There were still hard days, nights with thunder too loud, and mornings when Ruth would pause at the sound of hooves in the distance. But they always passed. The past didn't vanish, but it no longer chased her. It no longer chased any of them. It was late spring when Caleb first asked the question, "Are you going to marry Mama?" Ruth had her back to the door, folding sheets beside the stove. Elijah froze where he stood on the porch, just outside earshot, but close enough to catch the words through the open window. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Inside, Ruth went still, then slowly turned to look at her eldest boy, who was tracing the edge of the table with his finger, pretending like he hadn't said something world-shaking. "Why would you ask that?" she said softly, not scolding. Caleb shrugged. "Just seems like you smile more when he's near." Ruth gave a quiet chuckle, though her hands trembled as she stacked the linen. "Sometimes smiling's just remembering how. But you let him call the baby his." Ruth sat beside him. The light in the room was low, golden, filtering through the lace curtain like it didn't want to interrupt. "Because he's the one who stayed. He's the one who never raised a hand. And when he saw you, and your brothers, and me, he didn't see trouble. He saw us." Elijah leaned back against the porch post, eyes on the horizon, heart kicking like a green colt. Inside, Caleb pushed further. "You'd be safer if he stayed forever." "We are safe," she said. "But safer," he pressed. "And you wouldn't cry at night anymore." Ruth reached out and pulled him close. "You shouldn't know about those tears." "I know a lot of things I shouldn't," he said, and it cracked her heart. That night, when the boys were asleep and the baby dozed in the crib Elijah had carved with his own hands, Ruth stepped onto the porch. Elijah was already there, sharpening an old blade out of habit more than need. He paused, sensing her approach. She didn't speak right away. Just watched the trees in the moonlight. Then he asked if I'd marry you. His jaw flexed. "What did you say?" "I told him we're safe now, that you made us feel that way." He turned toward her, but her eyes were already waiting. Not searching, knowing. "I know you think you have to earn us," she said. "But Elijah, you already have." He stood slowly, not a word spoken, but his hand reached for hers the same way it had that first day by the fence. Steady, quiet, strong. She didn't pull away. The next Sunday, they walked to the chapel, Ruth in her best dress, Elijah in his dark coat, and all four boys trailing like ducklings behind. There wasn't a crowd, just the preacher and a witness. But vows said in small rooms can echo louder than the one screamed before pews. "I didn't think I'd ever be a bride again," Ruth whispered after. "I didn't think I'd be anything but alone," Elijah replied. They rode home with silence between them, but the kind filled with peace, not absence. When they arrived, Caleb had tied a ribbon to the fence post, and little Tommy had smashed wildflowers into a jar and called it a bouquet. The baby gurgled in the crib and held up his arms the moment Elijah stepped inside. "Papa," he called, clear as a bell. Not coached, not prompted. It stopped Elijah in his tracks. Ruth turned sharply, tears already gathering. Caleb's eyes went wide. Ben clapped his hands, and Tommy just grinned, proud like he'd built something. Elijah looked at the tiny boy, then to Ruth. "Say it again," he whispered, kneeling low. The baby reached out. "Papa." Elijah didn't cry. Not right away. He just pulled the child into his arms and held him like something he'd lost long ago and never thought would be returned. Later that week, a letter came from the county office. It was stamped and sealed and bore Elijah's name. Ruth watched him read it, brow furrowed. She couldn't tell if it was good or bad news. "It's about the land," he said. "Surveyors are coming. They're redrawing lines. Might lose the back hill." She frowned. "That's where the spring runs." He nodded. "We'll have to fight it." She looked at him, worried. "With what? Lawyers?" "No," he said. "With proof we've made it a home. That we've lived, worked, bled on that soil. That our children play there. That it's not just acreage, it's ours." They began gathering records. Letters from neighbors, sketches from Caleb, even Ruth's garden journals. Every piece of their life offered up like testimony. The day the officials arrived, Ruth stood with her boys in their Sunday clothes while Elijah met the men with calloused hands and a spine straight as his axe handle. He told them about the first fence he'd built with Caleb, about the tree stump he and Ruth had cleared where now the tomato vines grew. He showed them the pantry, the tool shed, the swing hanging from the oak. Ruth told them about the first winter and how they survived it. About the time one boy nearly choked and Elijah's hands saved his breath. About the birth of her youngest, how Elijah had boiled water and caught him in trembling palms. One of the men, an older fellow with thinning hair, asked gently, "And this man isn't their father by blood?" "No," Ruth said plainly, "but he's been more than that. He's been their father in every way that counts." The men left with heavy folders and heavier expressions. The waiting began. 3 weeks passed. Then a letter arrived. Ruth opened it with shaking hands while Elijah read over her shoulder. They weren't losing the land. In fact, it was being expanded. A neighbor to the north had ceded a parcel. Said he'd rather Elijah have it than see it auctioned. It was more than they expected, more than they prayed for. That night, Elijah built a fire and Ruth brought out the last jar of blackberry preserves. They sat with the children beneath a sky, so full of stars it looked like heaven was leaking light. "You ever think we'd get here?" she asked. "No," Elijah said. "But now that we have, I'm never letting it go." "Neither am I." The baby slept on Ruth's lap. Caleb leaned against Elijah's arm. Tommy told stories about horses he'd seen in dreams. And Ben tried to sing a hymn his mother used to hum when the world seemed bigger than his hands could hold. Elijah listened, not for threats, not for footsteps or riders or any sound of the past returning. He listened for peace. And for once, it sang louder than fear. By midsummer, the land had taken on a rhythm all its own. The garden flourished like it never had before. Beets fat in the ground, squash curling under the vines, tomatoes red as fire coals. Caleb had taken to watering early, before the sun burned high, and Ruth taught him how to check the soil with just 2 fingers pressed to the earth. He learned quick. All the boys did, but Caleb especially. He had his mother's instincts and Elijah's quiet resolve. Every morning, Elijah would rise before the house stirred. He'd chop wood, fix the chicken coop door, check the trap lines near the woods, not because he had to, but because the steadiness kept his ghost quiet. He never spoke of the woman he'd buried years ago, not directly. But sometimes Ruth would catch him standing at the edge of the fields, looking out like he was saying something under his breath to someone he used to know. Ruth never asked. Some wounds don't need words, only space to scab over and sun enough to heal. She carried her own memories, after all. Years of being told she was too much or not enough. Too loud when she fought back, too soft when she didn't. Years spent with a man who saw her more as a servant than a partner. A man who hit when the world didn't go his way and drank when it did. She had escaped with 4 boys, a broken rib, and a prayer. Now, she woke in a warm house, with little feet running across the floorboards, and a man who never needed to be the loudest voice to be the strongest one in the room. Sometimes at night, she would watch Elijah sleep, his brow relaxed, his chest steady, and wonder what grace had brought him to her. He didn't ask for anything, not even love, but he earned it moment by moment, until it filled every quiet in the house. One evening, a letter arrived with no name on the return. Elijah opened it under the porch light, and Ruth saw the color drain from his face as he read the first lines. She stood up sharply. Elijah. He handed her the note. It was short, barely 3 sentences, but it came from the man who'd once tried to sell Ruth's boys. He's out, Elijah said, released early, wrote that he deserves to see his sons. Ruth folded the paper with shaking hands. He won't find us. But Elijah didn't look so sure. They doubled the locks, moved the boys' beds into their own room. Elijah reinforced the barn doors and kept his old rifle within reach. The piece they'd built, so tender and slow, now held its breath like a deer waiting for a twig to snap. 3 weeks passed. Nothing. Then a man came up the road. Ruth saw him first through the curtain. Thin, angular, skin like wind-cured leather, and a cruel twist to his mouth she remembered all too well. He didn't look like a father. He looked like a man who thought the world owed him something just for breathing. Elijah was already on the porch by the time he reached the gate. "You lost?" he asked, voice flat. The man's eyes scanned the yard, pausing on the house, the fields, the boys' laundry strung up to dry. "I'm here for my sons." Elijah didn't move. "You sold them. I changed my mind." Ruth stepped beside Elijah. "You don't get to. They're mine." "They're not," Elijah said. "Not in any way that counts." The man laughed. "You gonna stop me?" "No," Elijah said. "The law will." He lifted a folded paper from his pocket, signed, stamped custody documents that declared Ruth's sole guardian and legally severed all ties from the man before them. The stranger read it, scoffed, then, in a blink, reached for Ruth's wrist. He never touched her. Elijah's fist caught him clean in the jaw. The man dropped to one knee, cursing, but before he could rise again, Caleb stood in the doorway behind his mother, holding a cast iron pan with both hands. "I already called the sheriff," he said. "He's riding in from town. Should be here before supper." The man didn't stay. He stood, spit blood, and walked back the way he came, muttering about women poisoning sons and men who didn't know their place. But no one followed. No one needed to. He was already gone. Afterward, Ruth crumpled into Elijah's arms. "I thought he'd take them." "I thought he won't," Elijah whispered. "Not now. Not ever." Caleb watched from the porch, arms crossed like a sentinel. That night, he asked Elijah something simple, but it knocked the breath clean from his lungs. "If he ever comes back, and I'm grown, can I protect Mama like you did?" Elijah nodded, swallowing hard. "You already do." Autumn arrived gentle. Cool mornings turning leaves gold and red. The fields yielded their last fruits, and Ruth spent evenings canning pears and apples, humming songs she half remembered from childhood. Elijah built a bench under the sycamore tree. The boys used it to carve initials with dull knives and hide marbles in the dirt beneath. One Sunday, a woman from the nearby mission rode up on horseback with 2 orphan girls in tow, twins, pale and spindly, with sunken eyes and tattered shoes. "They've been passed from home to home," she said. "Thought maybe—" Ruth didn't hesitate. She knelt and offered her hands. "You want to help me with biscuits?" The girls blinked, then nodded. That night, they slept beside the boys, wrapped in quilts Ruth had stitched from old curtains. Elijah built a cradle by morning. In the months that followed, laughter came back. Real laughter, the kind that bubbled up without effort, unburdened by fear. The house expanded in spirit, if not in size. And one day, as snow crept down from the ridges, Elijah stepped onto the porch with a parcel in hand. "What's that?" Ruth asked, dried her hands on her apron. "Something I've been saving for." Inside the box was a tiny dress, hand-stitched, and beneath it, a certificate, adoption papers, for every child in the house, including the twins. "You didn't have to," Ruth began. "I did," he said, because you were all given to me once, and now I give you back, but this time with my name." Caleb helped with the signatures. Ruth cried through hers. Even the baby smacked the table with his hand like he approved. When the snow came heavy, they huddled in the parlor beside the stove. Ruth read stories aloud. The boys built a fort of pillows and blankets, and Elijah sat back, one arm around Ruth, one cradling the baby. He watched them all like a man who never dreamed he'd be surrounded by so much life. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, love stood tall and unshaken. And when bedtime came, and Ruth whispered a prayer with the children tucked against her, Elijah added one more at the end. Not for more, not even in thanks, just a simple one, spoken in silence, held in the chest. "Lord, let me keep them." And somehow, he knew the answer was already yes.